Oh, hello there, and welcome back.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, as you can probably tell, I have taken the opportunity to practice social distancing. I've decided to do that in a fifth dimensional space, transforming myself eventually into the future man-like baby child thing. I'm sure you're all familiar with this from 2001: A Space Odyssey. Anyways, today's video is going to be about resource management. This is the fifth video in my series, Get Good. And yeah, we're going to be talking about resource management. I'm not going to stay in the fifth dimension. I don't think I don't even know if this is a funny joke.
All right. Yeah, I don't know that I'm just going to put this down now. Yeah. Yeah, today we're talking about resource management, and I think we can just jump into it after that weirdness. Yeah, so in terms of resource management, basically explaining what it is, just very briefly. The idea of resource management is that throughout the game, you have a number of resources in your hand at your disposal, and what you choose to use, when you use it, and then also what you choose to discard at any given point in time, because you'd rather see different cards, and it's okay. That's really all resource management is, right? So I think the first two things we're going to touch on are the differences between early game and late game resource management. So let's start with early game. Early game resource management, there's really two things you need to consider. The first of which is you need to know what your matchup is, right? There's a variety of matchups where you will play the exact same way regardless of that specific matchup because they're similar enough, right? But as an example, something like Obstagoon right now. In the Obstagoon matchup, you're playing basic Pokemon. So you're going to need your custom catchers or your Pokemon catchers or your great catchers or your Fion, right? All of those things are going to be very important for you during the Obstagoon matchup. So identifying that matchup helps you understand the resources that you need in order to win the game. Like those resources are your win condition, right? So you don't want to discard those. So even if you start off slow, you have a hand that's not great. If you've got some of those resources in hand, you can't discard them. You can if you think you can outpace them and keep knocking them out before they can get an attack off, but it's unlikely. And then what you might do is you might put yourself in a situation where later on you're like, oh, I wish I hadn't discarded X or used X. So yeah, that is an important aspect of resource management early on, is knowing your matchup. Now, once you do know your matchup, you hopefully understand the resources that are crucial for you winning. And then you understand, okay, well, look, it's the early game. Unless my hand is, all of my supporters and a Dedenne, like that would be very bad. But usually it's not that extreme, right? So if you have two supporters, and you can use one of them like a professor's research, but you have to discard another research, that's okay, I think. So it's really about not being afraid to then lose some of the resources you might have in hand in order to see different and more cards. That's another aspect of early game resource management, is being aware of what you need, but then not being too afraid to get rid of some of those resources in order to thin your deck and see more cards and set yourself up better. That's really what the early game resource management is about. Now, let's talk about late game resource management. In late game resource management, there's a variety of things that you can do with your resources, right? The first of which is cards that let you search your deck. Whether that is a card like a Quick Ball or a Cherish Ball, an Energy Spinner, a variety of different cards let you search your deck, even if you don't need a Pokemon or an energy or whatever, even if there's nothing in your deck, you can still use those cards to then go look at all the contents left in your deck to see what options you still have available. Those are very useful resources to just burn, one, because you don't want to draw back into them later, and two, to acquaint yourself with what's still in your deck. Another aspect of late game resource management is that, in some games, you can recognize a moment where you know you need to take a knockout in order to secure the win for yourself, whether that's this turn or the following turn, right? In those moments, if you know that you have the resources in deck that you need to do that, then it's really about, sequencing, like we talked about in an earlier video, to see as many cards as possible. And in those circumstances, you might have to discard a number of resources in order to get the thing that you need to secure your win condition. Because, a lot of games in Pokemon can sometimes turn on a dime, right? One bad turn and you go from being up to not being able to win. Those are moments when you recognize, okay, the resource I need right now is way more important than whatever else I might have in my hand. So I'm willing to discard some switches. I'm willing to discard a couple of supporters, etc. So yeah, that's the other aspect of late game, is knowing when it is the right time to really stretch, to grab resources in your deck, and thus discard whatever you might have in hand. On the back end of that, on the other side of that coin, if you will, there is the element of late game for you, but not for your opponent, where you might be up 6 prizes to 2, right? Or 2 to 6, if you get what I mean. Now, what that usually means is if you're that far ahead of your opponent, you've probably burned through a lot of your deck. You just got a very fast start. Odds are, if your opponent has a very competitive deck, they can burn through their deck as quickly as you did. And they still have access to all of those resources, most likely. So it's important then to not overextend or overuse resources. If it's late in the game, you're sitting on a bunch of tag calls and quick balls or whatever. Even if you're like, oh, I'll just burn all these cards and whatever, they might be useful later on if your opponent goes on a run and then ties things up. And then all of a sudden, all you have left are whatever you top deck and nothing to get out of that. So those are moments where maybe it's better to conserve some of your resources. Sure, you want to thin your deck, but conserve some resources, assuming that your opponent will make a late game run. And the last thing about resource management in the late game, which might contradict my last statement, but it's all about knowing which cards to burn and which not to and when, is really about stamp proofing yourself. So those search cards I mentioned earlier, even if you don't, need to get anything with them, sometimes you want to thin your deck out as much as possible. So even if you've got Pokemon in your deck that you don't need, right? You can still play a card, grab that Pokemon, and if you have a way to just discard them, do that. Discard them, get your deck as thin as possible so that if you get reset stamped or Marnied, you have a much higher probability of drawing in other cards you need to win the game. That is all about thinning your deck out, playing a bunch of the cards that you know you're not going to need the rest of the game in order to put yourself in a better position if you go into top deck mode. That's really the big differences between late and early game resource management. Beyond just like the strategy of what, when, let's just talk generally about resource management, knowing when to play cards and knowing when to hold cards in your hand for another turn. I think we were saying earlier that deck search can be valuable even if you don't need a specific thing. That goes back to early game, so it's okay to play some of those cards. Now, the important thing to remember about that, though, is that if you have a card, early game, let's say, or whenever in the game, that you can use this turn or you can use next turn, but whatever you go and get with that card, you won't be able to play this turn. Usually you don't want to play that card because, one, your opponent probably doesn't know that you have that card in hand. Odds are, like if you have a quick ball or a tag call or whatever it might be, they may not know you have that. The second you play that, now they know two things. They know, one, that you have one less of those cards in your hand, and two, they will know exactly what you got with the card that you played. That gives them information to potentially disrupt your hand. If you're not playing those cards immediately, then, and if you plan to play them on the next turn, I should say, if you're not playing those cards immediately, all you're doing is giving your opponent the opportunity to disrupt you. In which case, don't play those cards at all. Just sit on them, hold them, right? That's a very important aspect of resource management, is knowing when you don't want to give your opponent more information than they need. They might think you're in a really bad spot, and then all of a sudden next turn, because you had 4 cards in hand that they didn't know about, you may only have 5 cards and like, oh, well, I don't think they got it. And then you just go off and it surprises them, right? They play differently not knowing. Another aspect of playing versus holding cards, it's really what this whole section is about, is when to play and when to hold, is things like Pokegear. Pokegear is an interesting card. Cards that let you search the top X number of cards of your deck for a certain thing. Usually, if those cards are like item cards like Pokegear, I will not play those cards unless I need the card that I'm looking for immediately. Meaning, if I have another supporter I plan to play, and if that supporter, can't grab me whatever I'm looking for, why would I play the Pokegear, waste the resource, do so when my deck is not a card or two thinner? That's the thing, right? Like, if you don't hit it, you've wasted it. If you do hit it, your opponent knows you have it in hand, and then they could do something about that. If you wait, you will draw one more card out of your deck, and then you can play the card, thus making it more probable that you will find whatever it is you might have been looking for. So another aspect of not playing something unless you need it that turn. Beyond just playing versus holding general cards in hand, the last thing I want to touch on today is resource management when it comes to energy. The main thing, there's two things here. One of the main things is you don't want to overcommit your energy to just one Pokemon. When you put all of your energy on one Pokemon unnecessarily, you are allowing your opponent to know exactly what the threat is and go after that threat and that threat only. The difference is when you spread out your energy on the board, you force your opponent to make decisions. And every time you force your opponent to make a decision, to make a choice, you give them the opportunity to make the wrong choice. That is a very important aspect of this game in general, right? The more choices you give your opponent, the more likely it is they will make the wrong choice at some point down the line. I'll give you an example of this one. I was playing against somebody, and they had a Pokemon with a couple of energy on. They also had an Incineroar that only had one energy on. I made the incorrect choice to go after the Pokemon with more energy on immediately. Just didn't even think about Incineroar GX's ability to charge up and then how much damage that would do, etc. Afterwards, I realized I should have gone after the thing with less energy, but an ability to get more energy more quickly than the Pokemon with more energy. But again, that was a choice that was presented to me for me to make a mistake. That's a critical point of when you give your opponent information, is don't give them a clear answer to the question of what should I do next. That is really going to do it for resource management. Hopefully y'all are all staying socially distant from other people as best you can, getting some games in online. I'm trying to get some testing in person for Rebel Clash, to be honest, but we'll see. But yeah, thank you so much for watching. Subscribe if you like this stuff. I never say that, but if you do, like this, subscribe, all that jazz. And you can check out other videos in this series too if you're looking to get better. But I will catch y'all in a future video. Carpe awesome.